Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. Britain has been told it lives in an age of danger and instability, so it must pay more for security. In practice, that slogan has been converted into roughly £26 billion in extra taxes, pushed onto ordinary taxpayers and extended all the way to 2031. This is where the official story starts to fall apart. The conflict is simple. London claims a looming security crisis that nobody can clearly define, and uses it to justify a permanent tax squeeze on a country where real wages and public services are already under pressure. At the same time, the government promises to push defense spending to around 2.6% of GDP by April 2027, while the overall tax burden drifts towards the high 30s as a share of the economy. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this. Security is being treated as a pretext to hardwire a wartime tax regime into peacetime life. The mechanics are quite dry, which is why they work. The new plan changes income tax rules and national insurance in a way that looks technical, even boring. Thresholds are frozen. Allowances are trimmed. Contributions creep up. On paper, ordinary citizens are just asked to pay a little more. In reality, an estimated 1.7 million middle-income Britons are dragged deeper into higher tax bands and lose reliefs on savings and investments. In short, the state takes a larger slice of a pie that is not really growing. Now, here's the part that keeps economists awake at night. According to the UK's own budget watchdog, the total tax take is expected to reach roughly 38% of GDP in the coming years, the highest level in modern peacetime history. Not a temporary spike, not a crisis blip, but a new plateau. At the same time, the Treasury signals that a growing share of this money will be channeled into defense and security spending, while social programs and public services are quietly squeezed. This is the promise versus physics problem in its purest form. Politicians promise safety, deterrence, and moral leadership. The economic system can barely deliver stable, real incomes, functioning healthcare, and affordable housing. You see the problem here, right? If you're watching this from the UK, you don't need theory. You see it every month when your payslip shows higher deductions, while your local school, GP surgery, or council services are cutting back. This is the moment an abstract NATO pledge becomes a concrete line on your tax statement. The official justification is a familiar one: instability, threats, age of insecurity. Russia is presented as a potential invader of Europe, and Britain is told it must rearm to deter a hypothetical future attack. The interesting detail is what is missing. There is no clear, publicly presented evidence that Moscow has either the capacity or the intention to launch a conventional attack on Western Europe, while it is already tied down in Ukraine. There is one number in this whole story that nobody in London likes to say out loud. We'll get to it. For now, note the structure. The rhetoric is about defending democracy and rules. The plumbing is about redirecting civilian income into long-term military commitments, defense contracts, and foreign aid packages tied to the current conflict. Officially, this is framed as security. In practice, it behaves like a subsidy pipeline into the military-industrial ecosystem. There is a second contradiction. The same political class that campaigned for no tax rises for working people is now presiding over the steepest expansion of the tax burden in decades. Threshold freezes and stealth taxes do what open rate hikes would do, just with less noise. The state pretends it kept its promise. Your net income tells you otherwise. This is the structural flaw you can't fix with a press release. So, let's take a breath. Where does this leave us so far? Britain locks in roughly £26 billion in extra taxes, targets defense spending at around 2.6% of GDP by 2027, and nudges the overall tax burden towards about 38% of national output, all while telling citizens that this is a fair price for safety. And this brings us to the number that changes the equation. 0. That is the amount of concrete, verifiable evidence publicly presented that Russia is preparing an attack on the UK or Western Europe that would justify rebuilding a Cold War tax and military posture. We have narratives, speeches, think tank reports, but no clear casus belli. The threat is defined in language, not in disclosed operational plans. Now, here is where the story stops making sense. If there is no proven existential threat, then what exactly are British taxpayers buying with these extra billions? Part of the answer is simple. Higher revenue for defense contractors, more political capital inside NATO, and more room to finance multi-year support packages for Ukraine. Whether you view that support as necessary or not, the bill is not abstract. It sits on the accounts of British households, especially the middle class that cannot hide income offshore or hire tax lawyers. Does this look like a coherent security strategy from your corner of Europe, or just managed decline disguised as moral duty? From a systems perspective, the timing is almost elegant in its cynicism. The UK is still digesting the aftershocks of the 2008 crisis, austerity, Brexit, the pandemic, and the 2022 energy price spike. Real wages have been under pressure for years. Public infrastructure is tired. Trust in institutions is fragile. This is exactly the moment when you would expect a government to focus on productivity, energy costs, housing, and health. Instead, London chooses to hardwire a higher tax take and to pre-allocate a rising share of it to military spending. In short, the country is being told to live poorer now in exchange for protection from a threat that remains undefined. Now, here's the part no politician wants to explain on TV. Once you lift the tax burden to a new permanent level, it rarely comes back down. Governments get used to the revenue. Budgets, contracts, and institutions are built around it. Even if the geopolitical situation calms down, the fiscal structure stays. The risk is that Britain ends up with the cost structure of a war economy and the growth rate of a mature, over-leveraged service economy. That combination is not famous for producing stable middle classes. For small businesses and households, this shows up in boring, brutal ways. A few £100 more in annual tax here, a cut in reliefs there, higher payroll costs that make hiring riskier. A landlord facing a new property tax on assets above a certain threshold will try to push it into rents. An investor faced with higher tax on savings and capital gains will either move money abroad or simply invest less. This is how a strategic commitment becomes one more drag on productivity and long-term investment. If you work in manufacturing or energy, you've seen this movie before. Input costs go up, margins are squeezed, and then someone in government acts surprised when capacity quietly leaves the country. There is also a geopolitical feedback loop. Large, highly visible military buildups in Europe are presented as defensive. In Moscow, they are interpreted as hostile. That perception then feeds back into Russian military planning and propaganda, which is used in turn by NATO governments to argue that their populations face an even higher level of threat. The more you militarize to respond to insecurity, the more you help to manufacture that insecurity. And this is where the theory meets a brick wall. If you're watching this from the Baltics, from Eastern Europe, or from Britain itself, the pattern should feel familiar by now. First, there is a narrative of emergency. Then, temporary measures. Then, those measures quietly become permanent. Finally, when the bill arrives, you are told that there is no alternative, and that questioning the logic is disloyal. And this is the real price tag of the convenient lie we started with. The idea that you can buy absolute security with someone else's money without touching your own comfort, without changing your own strategic mistakes of the last 30 years. The likely trajectory is not dramatic. No Hollywood collapse, no immediate revolt, just a slow erosion of disposable income, rising cynicism, and a political class that keeps demanding more sacrifice while delivering less coherence. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and try to remember, slogans don't power grids, systems do.